The year was 1886, and the autumn air in the Wyoming Territory already carried the blade of the winter to come. It was a sharp, clean cold that scoured the high plains, bending the yellowed grasses and stripping the last stubborn leaves from the aspen groves in the hollows. For Elspeth, who had just turned 17, that cold was more than a season. It was a judgment. Her stepfather, a man named Hiram Poole, whose grief for her mother had curdled into a hard, practical resentment, had given her a canvas sack with a side of bacon, a small bag of flour, a single blanket, and pointed her down the track from his claim. His final words had not been cruel, merely empty. The world has no place for extra mouths. And so she had walked, not toward the sparse settlement of Fortitude, where pity would be a currency she could not afford to spend, but away from it, into the rolling, timber-studded hills where the land itself was the only witness to her survival or her demise. It was on the third day of this solitary journey that she found it. She had been following a shallow creek, seeking a place with water and some natural protection from the wind, when she saw the anomaly on the south-facing slope of a long, low hill. It was a subtle thing, a place where the curve of the earth seemed too perfect, too deliberate. A dense thicket of chokecherry and ancient gnarled sagebrush grew in a distinct mound, and beneath it, just visible, was a line of dark, flat stones set with a precision that nature rarely bothered to imitate. It was not a cave opening, but something built, something sealed. While another might have seen only a peculiar thicket, Elspeth saw the ghost of a human hand. She dropped her meager sack, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten, replaced by a deep and consuming curiosity that felt like the first stirrings of hope she had known in months. She began to pull at the brush, her raw fingers catching on thorns, her mind already working, connecting this strange discovery to the half-forgotten lessons of her father. The people of Fortitude, what few there were, learned of the girl on the hill from Amos Kelleher, a trapper and freighter who missed little in his territory. He had been checking a line of snares when he saw her, a small figure, working with frantic energy, digging at the hillside with a broken shovel head she must have scavenged. He watched from a distance for a time, his brow furrowed. The girl wasn't building a soddy or a lean-to against a rock face, the sensible first acts of anyone caught out before the snow. She was excavating, throwing dirt like a badger, focused on that strange spot on the hill. He rode into Fortitude that evening, the news tumbling out of him as he warmed his hands by the stove in the general store. "The Poole girl," he announced to the room. "The one Hiram turned out. She's up on Sage Creek Hill, digging at the old prospector's folly. Lost her wits to grief, I reckon. Digging her own grave, looks like." The assessment spread through the settlement like a contagion, passed between homesteads on horseback, and whispered over fences. Dora Kelleher, Amos's wife, took up the story with a grim, performative pity. "Poor thing," she would say, her voice laden with a sorrow that cost her nothing. 17 years old and the winter coming on. To lose your mother and then your mind, it's a tragedy. The community chorus agreed. It was a sad story, another testament to the unforgiving nature of the land. They envisioned her freezing to death in a damp hole, a pathetic end that confirmed their own wisdom in building sturdy cabins with good stone fireplaces and stacks of cordwood that stood like sentinels against the coming cold. Amusement was a safer position than compassion for some. It was easier to see her as a fool than as a mirror of their own fragility. Her strange, solitary labor became a local cautionary tale before it had even properly begun. Amos Kelleher, being a man who considered himself practical, felt a certain obligation. He rode out to see her a week later, leading a pack mule. He found the site transformed. Elspeth had cleared the entire face of the structure, revealing a formidable stone lintel and the top of a heavy, iron-banded door set deep into the earth. She was digging a trench before it, her face smeared with dirt, her movements economical and steady. He dismounted, his expression a mixture of pity and impatience. "Girl," he said, his voice rough but not unkind, "there's a blizzard brewin' in them clouds. You're wastin' what little time you have. That's naught but a root cellar, and a collapsed one at that. It'll be full of damp and snakes. You'll catch your death of lung fever in there before you ever freeze." Elspeth paused, leaning on the splintered handle she had fashioned for her shovel head. She looked at the man, at his sincere, misguided concern. She had heard this logic before, in the voices of men who knew how to follow the rules, but not the reasons behind them. She tried to explain, her words simple and direct, a distillation of a complex principle. "The earth is warm," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Deep enough, it doesn't feel the winter. It holds a steady heat." Amos let out a short, barking laugh. "Warm? Girl, have you ever spent a night on the cold ground? Earth is cold. It leaches the life right out of you. That's why we build floors in our cabins." He gestured vaguely toward the distant settlement. "You need timber and a stove, not a burrow." He saw dirt and cold. He could not comprehend the concept of thermal mass, the immense, stable heart of the planet that lay just a few feet beneath the frost line. He saw a hole. She saw a sanctuary. His failure to understand was absolute, and in that moment, she knew that explaining further was as useless as trying to explain color to a blind man. She simply nodded and went back to her digging, leaving him to shake his head and ride away, convinced of her madness. Only one person reserved judgment: Constance Hartwell, a widow who had lost her own husband to a logging accident 2 years prior, heard the gossip but did not partake. She knew what it was to be alone, to have your every decision scrutinized by those who slept warm in their beds. She walked the 2 miles to Sage Creek Hill one afternoon, carrying a small pail of fresh milk and a loaf of bread. She did not offer advice or pity. She watched Elspeth work, noting the careful way she assessed the stonework, the methodical manner in which she cleared the drainage trench. She saw not madness, but purpose. "It is good stone," Constance said, her eyes on the lintel. Elspeth looked up, surprised by the neutral, observational tone. "My father was a mason," she replied. "He taught me to read the rock." Constance nodded, placed the milk and bread on a flat stone, and left without another word. It was an exchange of respect between sovereigns of their own lonely kingdoms, a silent acknowledgement that wisdom could wear many faces, even that of a 17-year-old girl covered in dirt. Elspeth's father had been a man of stone and earth, a Cornishman named Thomas Penhaligon, who had brought his trade from the tin mines of his homeland to the raw geology of the American West. He had not been a man of easy words, but he had been a patient teacher. He had taught her not with lectures, but with demonstrations. He would take her to the mouth of an old mine shaft on a blistering summer day and have her feel the cool, heavy air that flowed out. The earth's breath, he would call it. It breathes out the cold in summer and the warmth in winter. In the dead of January, he would dig a hole 3 feet deep in the snow and have her reach down to touch the unfrozen soil below. "The frost is a skin, Elspeth," he had explained, his voice a low rumble. just a skin. The heart of the world is always warm. He believed that men built their houses wrong, fighting the elements instead of cooperating with them. They build boxes of sticks and sit in the wind, he'd scoff. They should learn from the fox and the badger. The safest place in a storm is the one the storm can't see. These lessons, which had seemed like a child's curious games at the time, now formed the bedrock of her strategy for survival. As she dug, she remembered his hands, thick and calloused, showing her how to stack stones so that the weight distributed downwards, each rock locking the next into place. He had explained the principle of geothermal stability, though he never used such a grand term. He called it ground warmth, a simple, reliable fact of the world. He explained that a structure deep in the earth was insulated by the sheer mass around it, protected from the wild temperature swings of the surface air. The key, he had stressed, was managing two things: water and air. A dugout had to be on a slope to drain properly, and it needed a way to breathe, not just for the occupant, but to keep the damp from settling. Watching an outcome, he had told her, was not the same as understanding the principle. Any fool could see that a cellar was cold. A wise person asked why, and learned that it was because most cellars were shallow, damp, and unventilated, designed to trap cold air. Her father had given her the gift of asking why. The work was brutal, a relentless physical demand that left her muscles screaming and her hands blistered and bleeding. She cleared the last of the earth from the base of the door, a massive thing made of thick planks of pine bound with straps of rusted iron. It was wedged shut by a century of settled earth and neglect. Using a long, sturdy branch as a lever and a flat rock as a fulcrum, she put her entire weight into the effort, grunting with exertion. For a full day, the door refused to yield. It was a silent, stubborn guardian of the space within. Finally, with a great, groaning shriek of tortured wood and rusted hinges, it moved. An inch. It was enough. She worked the gap, digging out more soil, pushing with the lever, until she could squeeze her way through the opening. The air that met her was not the fetid, damp smell of a root cellar. It was cool, yes, but it was profoundly dry. It smelled of ancient dust, of stone, and of a deep, still silence. Inside, the chamber was a revelation. It was not a simple dugout, but a room, roughly 10 feet by 12, lined with expertly fitted, unmortared granite stones. The work of a master. It was clear that the man who built this had shared her father's knowledge. At the far end, a pile of rubble and earth marked a collapse, and looking up, she could see a faint glimmer of light. It was a ventilation shaft, clogged but not completely destroyed. This was the second key her father had spoken of, a way for the air to move. The floor was hard-packed earth. The space was a perfect subterranean vessel waiting to be made habitable. It was more than a shelter. It was a promise. She felt a wave of gratitude so profound it brought her to her knees, a silent thanks to the long-dead prospector or hermit who had understood the principles and had left this legacy in the hill. Her first task was to secure the chimney. She spent 2 days carefully removing the rubble from the collapsed ventilation shaft, working from inside the chamber. It was dangerous, painstaking work. She created a small passage, just wide enough for smoke to escape, reinforcing the sides with smaller stones to prevent another collapse. Then she turned her attention to the entrance. She remembered her father explaining the concept of a cold trap, a simple but ingenious feature of deep mines. Cold air is heavier than warm air. It sinks. She spent another 4 days deepening the area just inside the door, digging a pit about 3 feet deep and 4 feet long, creating a well where the coldest, heaviest air would pool and remain, unable to flow into the main living space. Anyone entering would have to step down into this pit and then up into the chamber proper. It was an invisible door that would hold the worst of the winter at bay. Next, she lined the floor. Using her canvas sack, she hauled dozens of flat, water-smoothed stones from the creek bed. She fitted them together like a puzzle, creating a solid, dry floor that would not turn to mud and would help hold and radiate warmth. In the back corner, near the newly cleared chimney, she constructed a small, precise hearth for more stones, using wet clay from the creek bank as a crude mortar. It was not a fireplace meant for roaring, wasteful fires. It was a small, efficient stove designed to burn slowly, to heat the stones of the chamber itself, turning the entire room into a gentle, radiant heat source. Every action was deliberate, guided by the memory of her father's voice and the logic of the principles he had taught her. She was not merely building a shelter. She was tuning an instrument, bringing a forgotten design back to life. For the door, she knew the single, heavy barrier was not enough. An airlock, her father had called it, was the only way to enter a warm space from a cold one without losing all your heat. She scavenged wood from a stand of deadfall pines, laboriously sawing lengths with the dull blade of her knife and splitting them with a stone wedge. It was clumsy, imperfect work, but she managed to construct a second, smaller door and a frame, which she installed about 4 feet inside the main entrance, at the far end of her cold trap. She stuffed the gaps with dried moss and sealed them with more clay. Now, she could enter through the outer door, close it behind her, and only then open the inner door, preserving the precious, stable air within the main chamber. She chinked every crack in the stone walls she could find, making the small room as airtight as possible, save for the chimney and a tiny, low-lying vent she created near the inner door to allow fresh air to be drawn in for her fire. As October gave way to November, the work was done. She had gathered a respectable pile of dry wood, mostly aspen and pine, stacked neatly against one wall of the chamber. Her meager provisions were stored in a small niche she had carved out of the earthen wall. The nights grew colder, the frosts harder. From the settlement, they saw no light on her hill, no cabin smoke, and assumed the inevitable had happened. They spoke of her now in the past tense. But inside the hill, Elspeth was not just surviving. She was comfortable. She lit a small fire in her hearth each evening. The smoke drew cleanly up the flue, and the stones of the chamber slowly, almost imperceptibly, absorbed the heat. The air remained a constant, cool but not cold temperature. Somewhere in the 50s, she guessed. When the wind howled over the hill, she heard only a distant, muted whisper. The earth had wrapped her in its silent, heavy embrace. The first blizzard arrived not with a gentle warning of flakes, but as a sudden, violent assault. One afternoon, the sky turned the color of lead, the temperature plummeted, and the wind began to scream out of the north, carrying a horizontal wall of blinding snow. In Fortitude, men rushed to secure their livestock, and women stuffed rags into the cracks around windows and doors. The world outside vanished into a roaring, white chaos. They huddled around their stoves, feeding them constantly, yet the cold seeped in, chilling the floors and raising frost on the nails in the walls. Amos Kelleher looked out his window at the maelstrom and thought of the girl on the hill. He felt a pang of something that might have been guilt, but he pushed it away. There was nothing he could have done. She had been determined in her folly, and the land always punished folly. For Elspeth, the arrival of the storm was the final examination. She had secured the outer door, packing snow and earth against its base, and retreated into her inner sanctum. The world outside ceased to exist. There was no howl of wind, only the faintest, deepest murmur, more a vibration felt in the bones than a sound heard with the ears. The silence was absolute, broken only by the quiet crackle of the tiny fire on her hearth and the sound of her own breathing. This was the test of faith. She had food, she had water from melted snow she'd brought inside, and she had shelter. But she was utterly cut off, buried alive in her sanctuary. For 3 days the storm raged. She slept, tended her fire, and ate sparingly. She had to trust the stone, the earth, the principles her father had taught her. There was no feedback, no way to know if the snow was piling 1 foot deep or 20. There was only the process, the steady, quiet function of the system she had built. She tended her fire with a watchmaker's precision. A large, hot fire would have been a waste, consuming her precious fuel and overheating the small space. It would have drawn in too much cold air through the vent. Her goal was not to heat the air, but to warm the thermal mass of the stone and earth around her. She kept a small, glowing bed of coals, adding a single piece of wood only when necessary. The smoke rose in a thin, lazy ribbon up the chimney. The stone walls around her were never warm to the touch, but they were not cold either. They did not radiate the biting chill of a cellar. They felt neutral, stable. They were a barrier not just to the wind, but to the cold itself. The chamber had become a tiny, self-regulating ecosystem, a pocket of calm at the heart of the storm's fury. She felt a profound sense of security, a feeling she had not known since her father was alive. She was not fighting the winter. She was simply not participating in it. On the 4th day, the deep, vibrating hum of the wind faded. The silence that followed was even more profound. She waited another full day, letting the world settle, before she attempted to emerge. Unsealing the inner door, she entered the small airlock space. It was noticeably colder here, the air in the cold trap frigid. She pushed open the heavy outer door. It moved a few inches and then stopped, blocked by a solid weight. Snow. She began to dig with her hands and the shovel head, carving a tunnel upwards through the immense drift that had buried her entrance. The snow was dense, packed hard by the wind. Finally, her hand broke through into open air. She widened the hole and pulled herself out into a transformed world. The landscape was an unbroken, undulating sea of white beneath a sky of impossible blue. The air was so cold, it felt like breathing powdered glass. Every surface was covered in a thick layer of crystalline snow that glittered with a painful intensity. The silence was complete, the world seemingly frozen into a single, perfect moment. She took a deep, searing breath and immediately felt the cold penetrate her coat, a physical shock that went straight to her bones. Then, she backed down into her tunnel and re-entered her shelter, closing the doors behind her. The contrast was staggering. Inside, the air was still, calm, and while cool, it felt wonderfully, blessedly warm compared to the lethal environment just feet away. It smelled of life, of wood smoke, dry earth, and her own quiet existence. The sensory proof was undeniable. The principle was true. Her father had been right. In that moment of quiet triumph, she felt a connection to him that was more powerful than memory. She remembered standing with him in the foundation of a house he was building for a wealthy rancher. The rancher had wanted a deep cellar for wine and had worried about the cold. Her father had laid a hand on the thick stone wall. "This stone was here long before us, and it will be here long after," he had told the man. "It knows the rhythm of the earth. Trust the stone." The rancher had looked at him with the same polite disbelief as Amos Kelleher. But her father had not been speaking poetically. He had been stating a physical fact. Now, sitting in the quiet warmth of her own stone-lined room, Elspeth understood. She had trusted the stone. She had trusted the earth. And in return, they had held her safe. Not through magic, but through the patient application of a fundamental truth. Several days passed before Amos Kelleher could clear enough of the road to check his more distant trap lines. The snow was waist-deep in most places, and the effort of moving through it was exhausting. His own cabin had been a battleground against the cold. They had burned through a shocking amount of wood, and still the drafts had been relentless. As he neared Sage Creek Hill, he was thinking only of his snares, assuming that whatever tragedy had befallen the Poole girl was now buried under 10 feet of snow. Then he saw it. A thin, almost invisible wisp of gray smoke rising from the white flank of the hill. He stopped, certain his eyes were deceiving him, that the cold was playing tricks on his mind. But the smoke was steady. He pushed forward, his heart pounding with a mixture of disbelief and awe. He found her, outside the burrow, splitting a small log with a hatchet, her breath pluming in the frigid air. She looked thin, but she was alive and whole. He could only stare. We all thought you were dead," he stammered, the words inadequate. Elspeth merely looked at him, her expression unreadable. She did not offer recriminations or an "I told you so." She simply said, "The entrance is here, if you want to come in from the cold." He followed her, his skepticism warring with the impossible evidence before him. He crawled through the snow tunnel and stepped down into the entrance, ducking through the low outer door. She closed it behind him, plunging them into near darkness, before opening the inner door. He stepped up into the main chamber. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The air was still. There was no wind, no draft. The oppressive, biting cold was gone, replaced by a stable coolness that felt almost gentle. He saw the small glowing hearth, the neat stack of wood, the stone floor. He reached out and touched the granite wall. It was cool, but it wasn't the deathly, frost-covered cold of the stone foundation in his own cabin. It felt neutral, alive. He turned to her, his face a mask of stunned comprehension. "My house," he said, his voice hushed with reverence. "My house, with its great fire, is colder than this hole in the ground." The admission hung in the air, a complete and total surrender of his worldview. He did not stay long, but when he left, he was a changed man. His story back in Fortitude was met with outright disbelief, then grudging curiosity. It was Constance Hartwell who validated it. She made the trek herself, bringing a hot rabbit stew, and returned with the same look of wonder in her eyes. "She is not just surviving," Constance told a small gathering in the general store. "She is living. The place is calm. It is warmer than any root cellar. She has mastered something we do not understand." The community's perception began to shift, from pity and ridicule to a grudging, fearful respect. By the time the next, even fiercer blizzard rolled through in January, 2 families sent their children to shelter with Elspeth, a tacit admission that her folly was, in fact, a deeper wisdom. She took them in without question, sharing her space and her knowledge. That spring, Amos Kelleher came to her, hat in hand, and asked if she would teach him how to build a winter hold for his own family. He wanted to understand the cold trap, the ventilation, the reason for a small fire instead of a large one. Elspeth explained her father's principles, drawing diagrams in the dirt. She shared her knowledge as freely as it had been given to her. The idea began to spread. The next autumn, 3 more families dug similar shelters into the hillsides near their cabins. They were not primary dwellings, but they were lifelines. They used them to store potatoes and carrots, confident they would not freeze. They used them as storm shelters, places of absolute refuge. They began to call them Penhaligon holds, in honor of the father she had spoken of, the man who had understood the earth's secrets. Elspeth never left Sage Creek Hill. She expanded the shelter over the years, adding another chamber and a proper stone-lined larder. Her knowledge, born of necessity and rooted in her father's quiet wisdom, became an indelible part of the region's culture. The Penhaligon holds became a signature of the local architecture, a practical and elegant solution to the brutal winters, passed down from one generation to the next. Travelers would remark on the strange, hobbit-like doors set into the hills, and locals would explain that they were the safest place to be when the north wind blew. The structure Elspeth had uncovered and restored served her for her entire life, a constant, silent testament to the fact that the greatest innovations often come not from fighting nature, but from listening to its oldest, deepest truths, and that true sanctuary could be found by trusting the enduring warmth of the earth.